Hello friends, this is Ravi Zacharias. I cannot thank you enough for the kind of help you give to us, for the support you send our way, and because of that we are able to truly minister to our global audiences. Recently I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and something happened that had never happened to me before. I'd finished my message and I was walking away from the platform when something within me said, "Why didn't you give an invitation?" when we could sense the presence of the Lord so clearly there. So the chairperson had already taken to the microphone. I turned around and walked back and said, "Do you mind if I give an invitation?" He said, "Not at all." I extended the invitation. Literally 2 hours ago, I got a message from the gentleman who hosted that event, and he said, "I wish I could tell you all the stories of what happened that evening." One of those who gave her life to Christ was a 90-year-old Buddhist woman for whom people had been praying for many years. Isn't it amazing? I may never meet this woman this side of eternity, but walking away thinking your work was done for the evening, the Holy Spirit prompted me to go back and give an invitation, and a woman who's lived on this earth for 9 decades chooses to give her life to Christ that night. These are the kinds of things that happen, and they happen because you support this work. We need you to keep praying for us, praying for this extraordinary team, and to send in your gifts, and please do so generously. We will promise to honor that trust and use your gift for the purpose for which this ministry exists, to proclaim Jesus Christ all over the globe and answer people's questions. Ask the Lord what He would have you do, and thank you for your generous support. Are you ever mad at God? I think anybody who says they're not would probably be playing a duplicitous game. There are times on the inside you clench your fist.
Welcome back to Just Thinking. Have you ever been angry at God? Maybe you are right now. How do you respond? If you're a frequent listener of our program, you'll know that we normally reserve Fridays for our Q&A program. Today we wanted to bring you something a little different in an interview between Ravi Zacharias and Dr. Rosalind Hardin Scott. Dr. Scott is a licensed psychologist who has been working in the counseling field for more than 35 years. She specializes in psychotherapy with individuals, couples, and groups. She also handles women's issues and marital interventions as well. This interview, moderated by Bob Dittmer, examines an issue that has many Christians questioning God or their faith. Let's listen as we hear advice on what to do when we're mad at God.
Ravi, I don't know about you, maybe it's just me. It seems like I come across more people these days who are just plain mad at God. And I guess it's nothing new. It goes back to biblical characters like Jonah and Job and Jeremiah, so we've seen it before. Let me just ask you point blank, is it ever okay to be angry with God?
Your point is well taken, and one of the things about the Bible is that it does not hide the scars of its heroes. I think it's important for people to know that. And, when you look at the book of Habakkuk, basically Habakkuk begins by saying, "How long must I cry to you and you will not speak? The world is full of violence," he says, or evil or injustice. There are two ways to be, I think, angry with God, and one of it is sort of playing God. You think you do it differently, and there are many other ways probably. And the other one is, I think, what you see around you, which makes you wonder why God is not more active in it. In Jonah's case, he did not want to distribute grace to the Ninevites. That was a completely different reason. He was sort of playing God. He said, "Why do you want to forgive them?" So complete different perspective. But Job's case is, all right, if I have done something wrong, why don't you forgive, Lord? And why do you remain silent? Are you ever mad at God? I think anybody who says they're not would probably be playing a duplicitous game. There are times on the inside you clench your fist. I would say my own personality reacts sort of by grief rather than by anger. My personality is one that says, I simply don't understand this, Lord. I don't know if I clench my fist within me anymore, but it's a real emotion that comes into the mind, and that's the point, I think. But I'll be so eager to hear from Dr. Scott on this, who deals with it at a professional level and therefore knows the converging lines of other issues rather than just the theological one.
Well, Dr. Scott, let's turn to that. Do you see quite a few people who are feeling this anger or resentment against God?
Yes, very much so. It's even hard sometimes for people to find a word to use to express their anger, and so it is trapped inside, and it might lead more to depression. There are other folks that come and it's built to resentment, as you were suggesting, and there is a continuum. Often we start out feeling hurt or afraid, and if we're not aware of the hurt or the fear, it becomes anger. There's more energy in the anger, so it protects us. And we are then trying to, in an odd kind of way, protect ourselves sometimes against a God that we perceive to be someone who is working at odds with us. We forget about Jeremiah, that he is thinking about how he might work things together. Well, I think of the passage in Jeremiah as well as in Romans 8:28. He works all things together for good for those who love God. It's hard to believe that when we're suffering, when we're in physical or emotional or spiritual pain. And there are some of us that are more reserved and less willing to stand before a holy God with anger and feel it to be disrespectful and don't know what to do with it. And there are others of us that it has a physical impact because it's not expressed. And then there are times that we rage or we hold it in and it becomes bitterness and then resentment.
What happens, Ravi, with our spiritual walk when we get to the stage that Dr. Scott was just talking about?
You know, as Dr. Scott was talking, somebody came to my mind whom I know very well. It was a classic example of what Dr. Scott has just said. You sort of hold it in for some time and then withdraw, and then it builds into some kind of an overt rage. One of my friends phoned him and said, "Can we pray together before we leave?" He said, "Absolutely not." That was indicative of the fact that if he even allowed you to pray with him, it was giving in to God to a certain degree. And there I could just see the rage that has absolutely been built in. But I think in terms of your question, how do we deal with this and so on, I think that's a long journey back home, because it doesn't really come down to an immediate solution.
Dr. Scott, where do you find that the anger generally comes from when people are mad at God? Can you put it into categories? Why do people get mad at God or get angry with God?
Sometimes it comes from loss, hurt, loss, feeling violated. Those are all options, although there's not much energy in that and we're deflated, or there was a sadness sometimes mixed with the anger. There's also certainly a more narcissistic rage that comes, that it's more about what I don't have and what I think I'm entitled to. So I would say that anger is something that comes in relationship. If we don't have a relationship, or sometimes it's built frustration when there's a blocked goal. Those would be the two, I'd say. It is in the context of a relationship. So if it's okay for me to be angry with God, then he is more personal to me. But how does he stay holy and personal if I'm angry? And then I think of the passage in Ephesians 4, "In your anger, do not sin." So it's really important to be able to express it, to talk about it, to know what it's about, but to do so in a respectful fashion. So I would say that it's primarily people that are coming to me are hurt or afraid or have experienced a loss or violated.
You know, Bob, I was thinking of a picture in my mind. It takes me back many years during the Czech crisis when they were trying to break away from the former Soviet Union. I was only a teenager, but I recall so well seeing one young man running across the street, and there were stones being pelted at the tanks that were coming into the street, and there was one tank parked, and I saw a young man running across the street, stop, turn around, and kick the tank. You know, here with these big spikes on the tank with his sneakers, he kicks the tank and runs away, and I'm sure stubbed his toe even more in the process. That image, I remember as a youngster, stayed in my mind. What do you do when even in your weakness you want to kick at something that is only going to hurt you even more? My thinking is, when you look at anger, I look at my own life sometimes. My wife would be the best one to describe this to you. She'll talk about some people who, when they get angry, sort of and get it over with, you know. She says, "Ravi will just get quiet." You know, and she doesn't like that, I'm afraid. She doesn't like that. She says, "I wish you'd just say something and get it over with." It's not a good way to be. And so I'm wondering how sometimes in our personalities, As Dr. Scott has said, you're not even fully aware exactly of what is going on inside you. And it is important to process these things and realize that God is a forgiving God, like the waiting Father. He is standing outside when you come to yourself and return home. That anger is a process that can actually be debilitating to you psychologically, emotionally, physiologically, and it takes its drain. One other thought. I don't know if you've read the book, The Count of Monte Cristo, this man who is wrongly condemned and then put into prison. And he can hardly wait to get out of it. But the first thing he does when he gets out is he spends his time hunting for the one who wrongly accused him. And I don't know who it was I read years ago. He said, as terrible as it is to be the victim of such anger and revenge, he says it must be worse to be the possessor of that kind of emotion. And I think that's the downside of undealt with anger. Hello, friends. This is Ravi Zacharias. I cannot thank you enough for the kind of help you give to us, for the support you send our way. And because of that, we are able to truly minister to our global audiences. We need you to keep praying for us, praying for this extraordinary team, and to send in your gifts, and please do so generously. We will promise to honor that trust and use your gift for the purpose for which this ministry exists, to proclaim Jesus Christ all over the globe and answer people's questions. Ask the Lord what He would have you do, and thank you for your generous support. Maybe sometimes when we find this anger has taken its toll on us, we'd better get back to the Word and get back to God's GPS system and find out how He wants us to resolve this and get the right turn in mind to get us back onto the track that He wanted us to have.
Welcome back to Just Thinking. Today we bring you the continuation of an interview between Ravi Zacharias and Dr. Rosalind Hardin Scott as they talk about being angry at God. Is it possible that some people who are angry with God turn to sin out of their own bitterness? Let's listen in as Ravi answers this question.
From the point of view of apologetics, the way I see it is that it is interesting when a person has turned away, how they look for philosophical parameters that now justify whatever behavior they have gone to. It's a little bit like almost any philosophy, be it hedonism, be it postmodernism, which moves away from absolute truth. You will very soon find a horde of intellectuals behind it coming to now give you the philosophical framework for why you may think thus and why this is all right. I have found anger from people. Let me take a step back. What is important for the listener to hear is this. When you're debating the existence of God with somebody, the weakest point that they see in your argument is when you refer to an experience you've had with Him. You know, I remember I was driving along this and such happened. God clearly intervened. Or I remember coming to know Christ at a certain moment in my life. At that moment, the Christopher Hitchens and the Dawkins and all will just look at you like some kind of person in immense need of being expunged of myth and so on. And yet, if you go back to their own lives and ask them when they started to disbelieve in God, it'll be some experience they had. You know, they refer to an experience. I lost my mother, or I lost my brother, or I saw this on such and such a road. So all of a sudden, it's an experience in search of a philosophy. You know, you want to then build a framework from which you can justify why it is you're feeling this way. And the fact of the matter is, I think oftentimes that belligerence that comes in or hostility that comes in is nothing more than an unvarnished reflection of the deep feelings you really have. I was talking to the head of an atheistic association somewhere in the Midwest, and I was with a cohort of students around me, and he was very mild-mannered, very cool and calm, and so on and so forth. So I asked him whether he felt there was a moral point of reference to the Holocaust and so on and so forth. Bob, I had never seen such animation come in a dramatic way. Where is this God? In something like that. What about this God? And the word he used was, He's the greatest abortionist of them all. And it was almost like something was triggered inside that brought to the fore what the real problem was. He could not accept a God in this kind of world. And so that anger was built in, and the real atheist stood up at that moment It was an anger that could no longer be contained.
So you think that anger at God is at the root of a lot of atheism then?
It could be. I don't know if it's the sum and substance of it. It's certainly, in a milder form, a response to what they would see as an incoherence. It is a world that Dawkins will ultimately say there's no such thing as evil. But that's the very reason, actually, he walked away from God. There's too much of evil. So you see that incoherence in their own thinking. I wouldn't be surprised. I know the person I referred to earlier, clearly, if he came right down to it, would say, I'm angry with God. Lost a loved one, and then lost his job, and then lost his relationships at home, and now in his later years, in his 60s and all, has got this clenched fist. All along in his younger days, he was quite content to succeed and to be at peace. And now, if he was sitting around this table, he'd have the loudest voice on why he ultimately walked away from it. I'm sure there are many people for whom that anger is a real issue that turns them away. Life is so complex to reduce it to one single reaction, but it is a component.
Dr. Scott, we've kind of talked about the negative side of being mad at God, but I imagine there are people out there who are angry with God and mope around for a while and then forget about it. Is that a healthy way to deal with anger with God or with anybody?
I would challenge the individuals that say they have forgotten. Forgiving and forgetting are not the same, and neither is forgiveness requires some kind of resolution in relationship. And I think if there's going to be a sense of peace or restoration, then it does require a resolution. And you've identified your wife's response, Ravi, to your style of anger and this man who's angry with God about his loss. We each have a style of how we manage our feelings, in particular anger and conflict resolution. We may not be aware of that style, but we have one. And so if I believe that my style is to just kind of pout for a while and then I'm over it, it may look that way outwardly for a time, but if you followed that person over time, you would see it had some consequences on down the road. Either it's going to be in relationship, maybe not with that individual, but with another individual where it's easier to let it go and express it, but not in a positive fashion because this person is a scapegoat. Or sometimes, I think I referred earlier to it, your body, you are more prone to illness if things aren't resolved and there's anger that's inside. Sometimes that's what leads to depression, but not always. So I would say that if someone believed that they could just forget about it, I would feel sad for them because there's a richness in relationship and in restoration that's missing for that individual. And there's this interesting integration between cognitive and feeling. And so, the intellectual, one style that's intellectual would be to create a defense, more like an attorney. The advantage is that one is well-spoken and can defend oneself well. The disadvantage is it sets up a win-lose proposition, and that's not really what God desires. His design for us is a win-win, that in fellowship we're restored and the relationship wins as opposed to an individual. There are other styles, and a passive style that might look good on the outside then has and is actually leads more toward peacemaking. In the end, on its bad day, its liability would be that there may not be resolution and a restoration of the intimacy that we so desire that was broken early on.
I've got to think it would make it very difficult. Relationship is so important between God and man. That is key to our existence here. If you're walking around with this resentment that you're holding back, it probably keeps us from ever having that relationship that God would desire or that we would, correct?
It does, and I think Dr. Scott is right. The lateral implications are very real. It's the old idea of having a bad day at work, so you come back and kick the dog, that type of thing, the proverbial expression of it. Which of us doesn't know that emotion? I was speaking to a group of a couple thousand men in Australia, and one of the businessmen was telling me, he said he realized how much anger he had within him. And it's amazing when we talk about these subjects, how these stories suddenly come back. They say the sign of getting older is no matter what you say, it reminds you of something else. So here it is. He told me they were going to a church potluck supper. And he said his wife had made 2 very lovely cream pies, and so he was holding them both in his hand, and he was coming down the stairs to take it for the evening. and he stumbled. And when he stumbled, both of the pies came sliding out of the pie pans, and there they were at the bottom of the stairs. He said his first reaction was to get angry with his wife for not having covers on the pies when he was bringing down. And he said he started crying. He's a nice-looking young businessman. He said, it then dawned on me how narcissistic the idea of self-love. The first blame he wanted to place was on somebody else. And rather than saying, why was I foolish enough to carry two pies at the same time and try and balance it or be careful or think of it myself, my first reaction was to blame somebody who had nothing to do with what happened. So I think the most important thing here is what Dr. Scott has said is the word resolution. How do you resolve these issues? And maybe as you go on with the questioning here, Bob, I was thinking of my daughter Naomi, who, very transparent, and you know her well. And she'll just literally, she's so little, she'll still come and sit on my lap with her arms around my neck, and she'll just pour her heart out sometimes. And one day she said, Dad, I was driving home today and got lost, and I thought to myself, maybe God's will for my life is something like a GPS system. You make a wrong turn. And all of a sudden there's a voice that comes on and says, correction, make a left turn 100 yards ahead and turn left and then turn left and then you get back to where you were. And maybe sometimes when we find this anger has taken its toll on us, we'd better get back to the Word and get back to God's GPS system and find out how He wants us to resolve this and get the right turn in mind to get us back onto the track that He wanted us to have. Many of the saints, early church, full of conflict, full of the interpersonal struggles, and Paul himself sometimes very upset with certain things and, tells Mark, you just get on with it, I don't want you here anymore. You're not what this made of. And then in the latter stage of his life saying, give my love to him, and God has used him and so on. So I think we can look at anger as that positive reminder to us that we are not where we need to be.
So, Dr. Scott, how do we get back? I imagine you deal with a lot of people who are having issues of resentment and anger with other people or with God. Are there exercises or things that you have them do that help them get back to the right feelings that they should have?
Any growth and change is a process. As the writer of Ephesians has identified, we are to put off the old and put on the new. And that is a process. It requires figuring out what we're shooting for, what we want to give up, sort of what were the payoffs. It's a spiritual principle, but it applies to any problem solving. So I've got to have a new target in mind, and then I've got to figure out my steps to get there. So, yes, there are exercises in the sense of beginning to reflect on what I'm doing, whatever pattern of managing my anger right now, whatever pattern I'm using, it is working. At least it did once work for me, even if it's not now.
If you'd like to order a copy of this interview, call us at 1-800-448-6766 and ask for the title, Angry at God. You can also order online at rzim.org. Or if you're listening in Canada, that website is rzim.ca. While you're on our website, you might also want to look for the book titled Why Suffering, co-authored by Ravi Zacharias and Vince Vitale.
At RZIM, we aim to help reach students on college campuses and universities, encourage churches, and answer questions from Christians and skeptics. We hope you will prayerfully consider donating to our efforts, and if you'd like to find more about our work around the globe, be sure to visit our website. Just Thinking is a listener-supported radio ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks for joining us this week. Tune in again on Monday for more truth and solid insight. Until then, keep thinking.